The rain started just before midnight. By 4 in the morning, water was running across Daniel Mercer's farm in brown sheets, carrying loose soil down the hillsides and into the drainage ditch beside the county road. Daniel stood beneath the open door of an old equipment shed, watching lightning flash over 78 acres of worn-out Iowa farmland. The place had been planted in corn and soybeans for years. The ground between the rows had been left bare for long stretches of time, and every heavy storm seemed to take another thin layer of topsoil with it. By sunrise, fresh erosion cuts were visible across the southern slope. Some were only a few inches deep. Others were wide enough to catch the tire of a pickup truck. Standing nearby were 36 Katahdin sheep, packed tightly behind a temporary electric fence. A mobile chicken trailer sat farther up the hill. Several bags of red clover seed were stacked in the back of Daniel's truck. To most people passing by, the scene looked ridiculous. A former truck mechanic, a flock of sheep, a trailer full of chickens, and bags of clover seed were not going to fix decades of damage. At least that was what the neighbors believed. One of them slowed his truck near the gate, rolled down the window, and looked across the muddy field. "You planning to farm this place?" he called out. "Or turn it into a petting zoo?" Daniel looked at the muddy water leaving his property. Then he looked back at the sheep. "I'm planning to stop that," he said, pointing toward the ditch. The neighbor laughed, rolled up his window, and drove away. What nobody knew that morning was that Daniel had built a plan around those animals and those bags of seed. And within 1 year, that same damaged field would be producing lamb, eggs, hay, clover seed, and honey. 5 sources of income from land that had been losing both soil and money. But before that happened, Daniel came close to losing the whole farm. Daniel was 49 years old when he signed the papers. For most of his adult life, he had worked in a heavy truck repair shop outside Des Moines. He rebuilt transmissions, replaced diesel injectors, repaired hydraulic systems, and spent long winters keeping grain trucks on the road. He was good at the work. He could hear a bad bearing before most mechanics could find it with a diagnostic tool. The job paid well enough. He had health insurance, steady hours, and a retirement account that looked respectable on paper. But over the years, Daniel noticed something. The farmers bringing their trucks into the shop were getting older. Their equipment was getting larger, and their profit margins seemed to be getting smaller. He would watch a farmer spend thousands of dollars repairing a tractor, then complain about fertilizer prices, seed prices, fuel prices, land rent, and interest payments. A machine could be running perfectly, and the farm behind it could still be in trouble. Daniel started asking questions, not in a classroom, not in a formal way. He asked farmers while they waited for repairs. He asked truck drivers during lunch breaks. He listened when customers talked about drought, compacted soil, rising input costs, and another year of hoping commodity prices would move in the right direction. Then his father died. Daniel's father had never been a full-time farmer, but he had grown up on one. He kept a large garden, raised a few beef calves, and believed that land should always be left in better shape than it was found. After the funeral, Daniel found one of his father's old notebooks in the garage. Most of it contained ordinary things: fence measurements, feed prices, rainfall totals, and notes about planting dates. On the final page, his father had written one sentence: "Good ground should work for you, not disappear under you." Daniel read that line several times. 3 months later, he saw a bank listing for 78 acres outside Leon, Iowa. The farm had a small house, an equipment shed, a damaged cattle barn, 2 rusted grain bins, and more problems than the listing photographs showed. The previous operator had left after several difficult seasons. The soil was not ruined, but it was tired. The hills had visible erosion. Water pooled in the lower areas. Weeds filled the fence lines. The old well worked, but the water system did not reach most of the pastures. The bank wanted $238,000. Daniel put down nearly everything he had saved, financed the rest, and left the repair shop after 22 years. His former co-workers gave him a cake on his last day. Someone had written, "Good luck, Farmer Dan," across the top in green icing. They meant it as a joke. Daniel laughed with them. Then he loaded his tools into his pickup and drove south. He did not buy the farm because he believed farming would be peaceful. He had spent too much time around farmers to believe that. He bought it because he believed the land was being asked to do the wrong job. The old system depended on planting one crop across most of the acreage, buying fertilizer, buying chemicals, paying for fuel, and hoping the harvest covered the bills. Daniel wanted to build something different. He wanted every part of the farm to support another part. The sheep would eat forage and spread manure. The chickens would follow the sheep, scratch through manure pats, eat insects, and produce eggs. The clover would cover exposed ground, feed the sheep, support soil biology, and help supply nitrogen over time. Some sections would be grazed. Some would be cut for hay. Some would be allowed to flower for pollinators. And a smaller section would be managed for seed. Daniel was not looking for one miracle crop. He was trying to build a system where 1 acre could perform several jobs. For 6 months before buying the farm, he studied at night. He watched grazing demonstrations, attended soil health workshops, read extension publications, and visited farms using rotational grazing. He filled 2 notebooks with paddock sizes, feed estimates, fencing costs, egg production targets, and rainfall records. He calculated how many days the sheep could remain in each section. He estimated how much hay he would need for winter. He priced portable fencing, water tanks, chicken feed, seed, mineral supplements, and used equipment. On paper, the plan looked careful. Out in the field, it began falling apart almost immediately. Daniel closed on the farm in late February. Within 2 weeks, he bought 36 Katahdin ewes, most of them already pregnant. He chose Katahdins because they were hardy, did not require traditional wool shearing, and could perform well in a grass-based system. He also bought 80 laying hens from a farmer reducing his flock. The hens arrived in wire crates in the back of a stock trailer. The sheep arrived on a cold, windy afternoon and immediately tested every weak section of fence Daniel had failed to notice. By the next morning, 7 sheep were standing beside the county road. Daniel spent 3 hours moving them back inside while a school bus passed twice. That same week, a water line split beneath the old barn. Then the used utility tractor he had purchased refused to start. Then, one of the pregnant ewes developed complications. Daniel had repaired million-mile diesel engines, but he had never assisted a ewe during lambing. He called a sheep producer nearly 40 miles away and followed instructions over the phone while kneeling in straw at 2 in the morning. The ewe survived. So did both lambs. Daniel sat against the barn wall afterward, covered in mud and blood, holding a flashlight between his knees. For the first time since leaving the repair shop, he wondered whether his co-workers had been right. Maybe he had confused planning with experience. Maybe understanding systems was not the same as knowing how to farm. But the next morning, the ewe stood and called for her lambs. Daniel got up and went back to work. His first major task was getting something living over the bare soil. Instead of planting pure red clover across all 78 acres, he divided the farm into sections. He planted a mixture built around red clover, with orchard grass, annual ryegrass, and other pasture species suited to the area. Red clover remained the center of the plan. Its roots could help open the upper layers of compacted soil. Its leaves could protect the surface from rain. Its flowers could support pollinators, and when managed properly, it could become forage, hay, and seed. But red clover seed is small, very small, and Daniel's first planting went in just before the wrong kind of storm. Rain hit faster than expected. On the steeper ground, water carried seed downhill before it had a chance to settle. 3 weeks later, some sections were green. Others looked almost empty. The southern slope was the worst. Daniel walked it with a shovel, checking the soil, looking for seedlings, and doing the math in his head. He had already spent more than planned on fencing repairs, veterinary care, and purchased feed. Reseeding the failed areas would cost money he had not expected to spend. His neighbor, Tom Halverson, stopped at the fence one afternoon. Tom had farmed nearby for more than 30 years. He was not cruel, but he had little patience for ideas that sounded fashionable. He looked across the thin stand of clover. "You could still spray this out and put beans in," Tom said. Daniel shook his head. "I'm going to seed it again." Tom leaned against the fence. "Clover isn't going to pay for that mortgage." Daniel looked at him. "Not by itself." Tom smiled as if Daniel had just admitted defeat, but that was exactly the point. The clover was never supposed to work by itself. Daniel reseeded the failed sections using a lighter pass and better timing. He spread straw over the most vulnerable ground. He repaired the water system one line at a time and divided the farm into smaller paddocks using temporary fencing. Instead of allowing the sheep to wander across the entire property, he moved them frequently. They grazed one area for a short period, then moved on before eating plants down to the ground. Behind them came the chickens. Daniel rebuilt an old hay wagon into a mobile hen house with nesting boxes, roosts, water, and predator-resistant wire. The trailer was ugly. One side was painted red. The other side was faded blue. The roof came from an old machine shed. But it worked. At least it worked until the night something dug under the fence. Daniel found feathers scattered across the grass the next morning. 17 hens were gone. He followed tracks to the edge of the timber and realized raccoons had found a weak point near one of the wheels. The loss was not large enough to destroy the farm. But it hit him harder than he expected. He had been working 13 and 14-hour days. He had missed family dinners, slept through phone calls, and spent most evenings repairing something that had broken that morning. Now he was standing in wet grass, picking up feathers from birds he had promised himself he would protect. That afternoon, Daniel improved the trailer skirt, added electric netting, installed motion lights, and moved the hens closer to the house. Then he added one more line to his notebook. Every animal shows you where the system is weak. By late May, the farm still did not look impressive from the road. There were no straight rows, no towering corn, no shiny machinery moving across the horizon. There were temporary fences, water tanks, patches of new grass, sheep in small groups, and a strange chicken trailer that seemed to change location every few days. But beneath the uneven appearance, something was beginning to change. The soil stayed shaded longer after rain. New clover leaves spread across areas that had been nearly bare. The sheep began eating more pasture and less purchased hay. Earthworms appeared beneath old manure pats, and when Daniel pushed a shovel into the ground, the upper layer no longer broke into the same hard slabs. None of that paid a bill. Not yet. Then, on the third Saturday in June, Daniel loaded 52 dozen eggs into his pickup and drove to a farmer's market. He had washed and packed them the night before. The cartons carried a simple label printed at home: Mercer Ridge pasture eggs. He placed a photograph of the mobile chicken trailer beside the cooler. Customers stopped to ask questions. Where were the hens kept? What did they eat? Why were sheep in the background of the photograph? Daniel explained that the chickens followed the flock across the farm. He expected people to smile politely and keep walking. Instead, he sold every carton before noon. The next week, he brought 68 dozen. Those sold too. A small grocery store in town agreed to take 20 dozen every Friday. Then a cafe asked for a standing weekly order. The egg money was not enough to cover the whole operation, but it covered chicken feed. Then it covered fuel. Then it began covering part of the farm payment. More importantly, it proved people were willing to buy a product connected to the way the land was being managed. In July, the red clover came into full bloom. The change seemed to happen almost overnight. Fields that had looked thin and uncertain in spring turned deep green, then filled with red-purple flowers. Daniel stood at the top of the southern slope early one morning and listened. The field was humming. Bees moved from blossom to blossom. Butterflies worked the edges. Birds followed the sheep through the taller grass. Daniel had placed 12 rented bee colonies near a sheltered fence line through an arrangement with a local beekeeper named Carla Ruiz. Carla managed the hives. Daniel provided the forage and location. They agreed to split a portion of the honey sales. The honey would not come only from red clover. The bees also worked wildflowers, field edges, fruit trees, and other blooming plants nearby. But the clover extended the farm's flowering season and gave the hives another dependable source of forage. Daniel had expected the bees to be a small side project. He had not expected customers at the farmer's market to begin reserving jars before the honey was even harvested. At the same time, he set aside several acres of the best clover stand instead of grazing it. One portion would be cut and baled. Another would remain standing longer for bloom and possible seed production. This was where the system became more complicated. The same acre could not be heavily grazed, cut for hay, allowed to flower, and harvested for seed all at once. Daniel had to make choices. He divided the fields according to purpose. Some paddocks were managed primarily for grazing. Some were rested for hay. Some were allowed to flower for pollinators. A smaller block was reserved for seed. The farm was not 5 businesses stacked perfectly on top of one another. It was one landscape being scheduled carefully through the season. That was where Daniel's years as a mechanic helped him. In the repair shop, every job had depended on timing. A truck could occupy one bay while parts were ordered. Another job needed to be finished before the afternoon delivery. One mechanic could not use the same equipment in 2 places at once. The farm worked the same way. Animals, plants, weather, labor, and customers all had to arrive in the right order. By August, Daniel sold his first load of small square hay bales to a nearby horse owner. The buyer inspected the bales, broke one open, smelled it, and nodded. "I'll take all 140, he said. Daniel tried not to show how much that answer mattered. He had nearly run out of cash 3 weeks earlier. The hay sale gave him enough room to pay for winter fencing supplies and reserve a date with a local processor for the first group of lambs. Then came the weather forecast. 4 to 6 inches of rain, possibly more in isolated areas. The storm was expected to arrive late Friday and remain through Saturday morning. Daniel had seen forecasts like that before. Usually they changed. This one did not. By Friday evening, the sky had turned the color of steel. Daniel moved the sheep to a sheltered paddock, secured the chicken trailer, checked the hives, and cleared debris from the main drainage area. Tom Halverson stopped his truck near the gate. "You ready for this?" he asked. Daniel looked toward the southern slope. "We'll find out." The rain began after dark. It struck the farmhouse roof hard enough to drown out the television. Water filled the gutters, spilled across the yard, and ran toward the lower fields. Daniel checked the animals twice during the night. At 3:30 in the morning, he walked to the equipment shed and shined a light across the nearest pasture. Water was moving, but it was not moving the way it had during the first storm. Instead of racing across bare ground in broad muddy sheets, much of it was slowing beneath the pasture cover. The plants bent under the rain. Residue from earlier grazing protected the surface. Roots held soil in place. Small amounts of water still flowed toward the drainage area. No system could make a major storm disappear. But the water was clearer, and the soil was staying where it belonged. At daylight, Daniel drove the edge of the farm. The southern slope had always been the test. Months earlier, it had been streaked with erosion cuts and thin patches. Now it was covered with clover and grass. Water had moved through the field, but only a few small rills had formed. Most of the ground remained protected. Across the road, water from a recently worked field poured through a culvert in a thick brown stream. Tom's truck appeared just after 7. He parked at the gate and walked toward Daniel without speaking. Together, they stood beside the drainage ditch. Tom looked at the water leaving Daniel's farm. Then he looked across the road. "That yours?" he asked, pointing toward the clearer flow. Daniel nodded. Tom walked several yards into the pasture and pushed the toe of his boot into the ground. He bent down, pulled apart the clover, and studied the soil underneath. For months, Tom had treated Daniel's farm like an experiment that would eventually prove him right. Now the experiment had answered for itself. Tom stood up. "I thought all that grass would waste good crop ground," he said. Daniel waited. Tom looked across the field again. "I might have been wrong." For Daniel, that sentence mattered more than the first egg sale. The storm did not mean the soil was completely restored. One growing season could not erase years of erosion. It did not mean every decision Daniel made was correct. He still had thin areas, weed pressure, winter feed costs, and a mortgage that arrived every month whether it rained or not. But the storm proved the farm was moving in the right direction. The land was holding more cover. The water was slowing down. And the system was producing food while that improvement was happening. By early fall, Daniel began selling lamb directly to customers who had reserved shares in advance. A local restaurant bought a limited number of cuts for a seasonal menu. The lambs had spent most of their lives on pasture, moving through the same fields the chickens later followed. The eggs continued selling every week. The first honey harvest produced fewer jars than Daniel had hoped, but every jar sold. The hay buyers asked whether more would be available the following year. The clover seed block was harvested with rented equipment and cleaned through a local operator. The yield was not extraordinary, but nearby landowners purchased much of it for pasture renovation and cover crop use. By the end of the farm's first full year, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a calculator, a stack of receipts, and the 2 notebooks he had started before buying the property. The farm had generated income from 5 main products: eggs, lamb, hay, clover seed, honey. Gross sales reached a little over $61,000. That was not a fortune. After feed, fencing, processing, repairs, seed, fuel, veterinary expenses, packaging, insurance, and loan payments, the amount left was modest. Daniel was not suddenly rich. He was not buying a new truck. He was still doing occasional repair work for neighbors to bring in extra cash during winter. But the farm had covered its operating expenses. It had made its scheduled payments, and it had done so while purchasing less feed than Daniel had originally projected. The most important number was not on the income statement. It was outside. 78 acres that had once spent part of the year exposed were now covered for most of the growing season. The southern slope still carried scars from older erosion, but new cuts were smaller and less frequent. The sheep had more forage. The chickens had more ground to work. The bees had a longer flowering window, and customers were already placing orders for the next season. Tom Halverson became one of the first neighbors to ask for Daniel's clover seed. He started with 11 acres. Daniel helped him set up temporary fencing and walked the field with him before the first grazing rotation. At one point, Tom stopped and smiled. "Still looks a little like a petting zoo," he said. Daniel laughed. "An expensive one." Tom looked down at the clover around his boots. "Maybe, but at least this one pays." Daniel Mercer did not save his farm with a miracle. He did it by refusing to ask one crop to carry the entire business. The sheep created meat and moved nutrients. The chickens created eggs and worked behind the flock. The bees created honey and added value to flowering fields. The clover fed animals, covered soil, supported biological activity, became hay, produced seed, and helped hold the farm together when the rain came hard. Each part had weaknesses. Together, they became harder to break. And that may be the most important part of Daniel's story. Restoring damaged soil does not always mean taking land out of production and waiting years for something good to happen. Sometimes the process of recovery can become part of the business itself. The plant protecting the soil can also feed the livestock. The livestock can help manage the plant. The flowers can support pollinators. The extra growth can become hay. The mature stand can produce seed. And the customers buying those products can help finance the next season of improvement. A year earlier, Daniel had stood beneath an equipment shed and watched muddy water carry his farm away. 12 months later, he stood in nearly the same place after another heavy rain. The ditch still held water. The hills were still steep. The work was nowhere near finished. But the water leaving the farm was clearer. The sheep were grazing behind a fresh line of fence. The hens were scratching through yesterday's paddock. Bees moved across the clover blossoms near the field edge. And for the first time, the land was not simply producing a crop. It was becoming a system. A system that could feed animals, protect soil, support pollinators, and generate income without forcing Daniel to choose only one of those goals. He had spent 22 years repairing machines after individual parts failed. Now he was building something where the parts kept one another working. And it all started with 36 sheep, a patched-up chicken trailer, a few bags of red clover seed, and one decision. He would no longer watch good ground disappear under him. If this story reminded you that the best solutions are not always the biggest or the most expensive, subscribe and come back next week. Because the next farmer in this series did something even more unusual. He released pigs into an abandoned hillside orchard, planted chestnut trees behind them, and turned ground nobody wanted into one of the most productive parts of his farm.